Welcome to the Shannyn Moore Show. I'm Shannyn Moore. It's 6 minutes after the hour here in the lovely, yet rainy outside, KOAN radio studios. I know, broadcasting here at 95.5 FM, 1020 AM. Also, 1480 We Act Radio in Washington, D.C., Netroots Radio around the country, and streaming at 1020koan.com. Okay, as promised on Monday, I was going to be gone yesterday, which I was, on a fishing trip. I was out with the Seward Fishing Club, having an awesome time, Randy Becker's outfit, and fishing silvers all day. But I promised you if you could hang in there for an awesome rerun, that tonight we would have a little treat for you, because I love you, and I make sure that you have awesome little treats whenever I can. See how I am? I know. So, yeah, we're going to interview Scott Walker. No, not the ass hat governor. No, not that guy. Ugh, ew. No, Scott Walker, the writer and director of The Frozen Ground. And he's joining us on the line. How are you?
I'm great, Shannyn. How are you? Thank you for having me on.
I'm so delighted. I have to tell you, and you, of course, have made a film with John Cusack, Nick Cage, lots of other folks, and it's an Alaskan story. It's one of our stories, and it's a story that we don't like very much, about Robert Hanson's serial killer. And I had a lot of reservations about this film being made. I really did, until I talked to you when you were here. Can you explain to folks why you wanted to tell this story and what you thought this story would be about?
Well, Shannyn, I never actually set out to find any serial killer to make a film about. It wasn't sort of, that was not my intention. In fact, I was working on something completely different, which was a victim story. It involved a hunter, and there was a kind of a interesting area there around obsession and the determination of some hunters. And it was going to be a drama, and I was talking to somebody, actually I was in London, and they said, have you heard of Robert Hanson? What you're talking about sounds very eerily similar to what he did. And I had never heard of him before, and so I looked it up, and actually at that point, when I found out that I really didn't want to make the film at all, I didn't want to make the film that I made, and I didn't want to make the other film that I was making up. And I just felt that, you know, what this man did is such horrific events, so tragic, so awful, and the ripple effects through so many people's lives to this day. I was questioning, like, why on earth would I want to make a film like that? And but the more I researched it, the more I became interested in the idea of telling it as a drama from a victim's perspective, with as much integrity as I possibly could, and as much honoring the truth. Obviously, I'm not making a documentary; I'm making a feature film, and it brings with it a whole of structural issues and things, how you can create it for an audience to actually enjoy. So I did a lot of research with local Alaskans, a court researcher for about 6 weeks, getting me every single case file that was accessible, and then a journalist who helped me enormously by going into archives of Anchorage Daily News and the other places that were out there to try and get everything that wasn't digitized from back in the day. And then once I'd got enough of that information, I kind of felt, well, now I'm not going to ask too many stupid questions. I can actually phone up some of the real people. And one of the people that I phoned up was Glenn Fothey, and he was the lead investigator of the case back in 1983 and 1984. And I explained to him what I was thinking of doing, and I really said to him, but, you know, this is the beginning of my process, and I really don't want to make this film if local people don't want it to be made. I'm not going to force anything here. And if it is feeling like the direction I think it could go, it feels like the right direction or a good direction as a way of telling the story, then I'll pursue it. And if not, I'll go off and do something else. And so I came up to Anchorage in February of 2009 and met with Glenn, and ended up meeting up with a load of other people. And Glenn said, look, I'll help you. I think you're going in the right direction if a film is going to be made about this matter. But he said, look, I'm not the hero. We were all just doing our jobs, and none of us, want to be famous and things like that. So the real hero in this situation is Cindy Paulson, who he said, I think she's the one you need to find. And I'd read quite a bit about her, not an enormous amount because nobody's actually ever spoken to her. And so I just, from that, understanding from his perspective how she was involved in the case and her story, and really her being not such a representative, but a voice of the victims who came from very different backgrounds and mothers, sisters, daughters, and not all were strippers or worked on the street, and just people in the wrong place at the wrong time sometimes. And I just wanted to go, kind of tell a story. It was through these two very different people's relationship, much more as a drama than anything else. And I eventually met the real Cindy Paulson and interviewed her for about 50 hours over a week, and just to get everything about her story from the day she was born through to where she is today. And that really started this is the film I think I want to make. And of course I was only just starting to scratch the surface of the truth about the story, and then the overwhelm of information, and how on earth do I now tell this in less than 2 hours?
Right, and what an amazing challenge, because you hadn't made a film before, and no. This is your first film. You've got Nick Cage, you've got John Cusack, Vanessa Hudgens, you've got everybody stacked up at the Captain Cook Hotel. And you're trying to tell this story. And I think, when I spoke to you when you were here about it, the whole story broke when I was 15 years old. And Cindy Paulson was only 17 when this happened, where she was captured by Robert Hansen, the serial murderer and rapist and torturer and, monster, basically. And she got away. And, Glenn Floethe is one of the most remarkable Alaskans, and I hope to God that more people know his name than Palin's, because as humble as he is saying, I was just doing my job, he did he caught a serial killer. I mean, he did this thing, and it was remarkable. It really was.
He is an incredible man. He's incredibly humble, and it's an extraordinary story. And Cindy was 17 at the time, and and she'd had a history, and so people didn't believe her, and it's almost a cliche, but it's the crazy thing is it's still happening today. You've only got to turn on the news and see what's happening, and and it was my first film, so I think a degree of naivety and sort of not quite knowing how this was going to take shape went a long way. And but I think that's probably now what I've now learned is that's true of every film project. You never really know where it's going to take you. You just kind of take step after step, especially if you're researching a true story and you meet the real people and you meet families of victim members, and everybody, all of that impacts on how you then tell the story. And I felt this enormous weight of kind of responsibility to try and tell it in a way tonally that is, I don't know if there's a right way, but wasn't exploitative and wasn't commercializing or glorifying what Hansen did, but tried to show the reality of what happens when you almost get dropped into the middle of a case like this, and how it's intense and it's heavy and it's dark and it's sad, and and Cindy is almost like a little bit of light at the end of the film, of her redemption. And so amazing journey, and a film got made along the way.
And Glenn Floethe, who Nicolas Cage plays, he was a tremendous asset for you on this film, was he not?
He was. There were a number of really helpful people, and Glenn was one of them. He was terrific. It's just we see so much of this on the news and on TV and great theories, and there's a lot of police programs out there, and But we forget that in 1983 there was no DNA, there was no hair and fiber analysis, there was no blood work really, like there is anything like there is today. And so what was great was I went back to the beginning to get an education of 1983 homicide detective work, and what you have and haven't got to work with, and just the reality is that it's a sheer mountain of evidence that you're looking to acquire in order to just even get a warrant, let alone an arrest. So yeah, having people who were there in that case, in that period, and could explain the realities and the limitations was an enormous help to try and almost and then go and take the audience back to that stage. And a lot of people probably might not even realize, and probably wondering why they didn't do a DNA test, but I wanted that to be in there as part of the police procedural side of the film.
Well, and how helpful for you making the frozen ground here in Anchorage is that we're still driving that era of cars, just regular day.
No, well, I'm going to say, I'll tell you, I thought this was going to be easier, but unfortunately, the amount of salt and grit that goes on the road doesn't act well with cars. And when I thought it'd be easy, you can pretty much go anywhere and find really great collection of old cars for the period. But not so. The further north you go, the harder it is to find. And whenever there's snow, that means there's going to be rust and cars fall apart completely. So it actually became really difficult to try and find old late 70s, early 80s cars. So we found quite a few there. It was amazing how many people came and supported and brought their cars out for nights on 4th and 5th Avenue when we were filming, and parked them on the side of the street. When
it was 20 below. I mean, the frozen ground, literally, it was ferociously cold out there.
It was.
I think one of the things about this film that I thought, when I sort of flipped and I was like, okay, I'm really happy this person in this time in this place is telling our story the way he is, even though it's difficult to look at. So many women, dozens of women were disappearing out of Anchorage over a period of time. And it's one thing to look at Robert Hansen, who I just saw the prison he's still in yesterday. And it was just kind of like, ugh, I'm going fishing. But there's that part of it, of him being a monster. But there's also the allowance. It was like these women were disappearing, and it was kind of like he was taking out the trash. It wasn't like, people weren't all up in arms because, the cheerleader was missing from school. It was, who was looking for these girls, and how a predator gets a certain amount of permission from society when they look down upon a class of people, because then they can predate on them.
Yeah, and actually, Judge Ralph Moody at the sentencing in 1984 basically said every part of the legal system has failed these women, and he put himself in that collective pot of the blame, and he said this is the greatest indictment against our society that I can remember, and really that was because over the 12 or 13 years he was preying on these young girls, and he knew the system and people. He knew how to manipulate people incredibly well, and play one type of guy to his friends and the people that he would hunt with or socialize with or go to church with, and then he had a completely other different side of him, and that he knew he played that very successfully, unfortunately.
Right. If he was a troll that lived under a bridge, he wouldn't have been able to get away with this. In fact, he was a baker. So
yeah, and that's actually that was very key in me approaching John Cusack to play the role. Was I didn't want to create this character as someone who is like a Hollywood monster, like a Hannibal Lecter, who you'd know if he wants to eat you because if he was sitting in front of you. And he's so obvious. He's a great character, but not very truthful. And yet these predators, these serial murderers, they get away with it for years because they blend in, and to all intents and purposes, they look normal. And when John and I first met, I said to him, the way the character is written is based on transcripts and psychological analysis and profiles from the very, very beginning of the FBI Quantico Behavioral Sciences team who worked the case with Glenn and a few others back in 1983. It was the second case I'd actually ever worked on. And I said, that's how the character is created. And I think he needs to be played very, very normal. And John was really pleased to hear that, because he said his concern was that I would want him to do the opposite. And so I thought he would just be an amazing partner, but also amazing person to bring this character to life. And because you just don't, you look at him and you think, it's not possible that he could do these things, which is exactly what I think. At least some people, in hindsight, and maybe at the time, thought, well, Bob's a bit weird at times, but nobody suspected he was capable of this, even though he'd actually been caught and put in front of courts for cases like this, in 1971 and another time. So,
right. And Alaska was a place a lot of people came to disappear from their records, their past, and
yeah.
That was a pretty common thing.
Yeah, and at the time it was the end of the pipeline, the last days of the last year of the pipeline, years of the pipeline, and people were coming from all over, and I think there's a line in the film, Lyle Hudgens, who had been working blue collar in the Criminal Investigation Bureau of the Alaska State Troopers. He had then switched over into looking after missing persons, and there's a line in the film where Nicolas Cage's character goes to Lyle's desk to kind of like see if he can find some files to start working on the case, and asks how many cases have you got, and he says, well, there's over 600. And that's like all missing people, so everybody, including hunters, boaters, hikers, people who just wandered off, and that was the reality. And when you've got that many people, and then you take these girls who some of them were transients, or they're not going to stay around long, and most girls who are on the street, they're not using their real name, or if they're working in bars, they don't even want to use their real name, and that can be just like as waitressing, and so the whole complexity of, well, how do you even find people who don't even use their real name, and they may have left the state and nobody knows that they're here. In one case, there was a church group who was trying to help girls and just getting them secretly out of the state, and those girls' names were high on the missing persons list and suspected victims list, and then the church group has to let the police know. I think Maxine Farrell, who was an APD at the time, was one of the real leaders of the case back from that side of it. And before Greg Baker and Glenn Flote got on board, and it's like nobody knows who's missing, and the church group would inform her, by the way, 2 months ago we flew those girls out of the state, and we didn't want to say anything in case the bar owners retaliated, and
right.
It's just a really complicated, and unfortunately that's the challenge in a film, is you're trying to fit that context into 2 hours and tell a story of the police case and what Hansen was up to and what Cindy's involvement was. But really, it's the girls were massively let down on all fronts, and I'm not making any excuses for that. But there was a complexity to trying to understand this case.
Right.
And
there was something called crab pot justice back then, where if somebody was abusing their wife or they would beat up somebody or whatever, they just got put in a crab pot with no buoy on it. I mean, it was crab pot justice. And so you're right. It is hard to get all of that in. So it's been almost 2 years since you were here. Actually, it has been 2 years since you first came up.
In 2009, so it's been 4 years.
Wow. So, but I was thinking when you started shooting and filming this, what, is 2 years normal to take that long to put a film out? What was the...
There's in making a film, especially a film of which involves a studio and a relative size budget. This is a sort of a good size budget, it's a medium budget for a Hollywood film. There is no normal how long does it take. We got caught in the middle, or we got sort of stalled in the middle of once the film. I'd finished the film and screened at the Lionsgate, and they were like, "Great, this is going to be theatrical." And then Lionsgate bought Summit Entertainment, and we went through a process about 5 or 6 months where these two big studios were merging. And ours wasn't the only film in this situation. There were a lot of films, suddenly two studios coming together of like,
right.
You're just going to have to sit tight and wait. And when we know who's going to run the studio, who's going to look after what, and who have what responsibilities, and who's no longer going to be here, then we'll come back to you. And so it was about a 5 or 6 month wait until October last year. So from like April to October, we waited. And then finally, it was like, okay, this is what's going to happen, and here's the notes you've been waiting for, and you've got 3 years to go in and finish the film, and that was it. And so literally the end of November, beginning of December, I actually finished the film, and by then we were into Christmas, so we missed what would have been a good window last November, and that was put on the internet that was going to be released in November, which was never going to happen. It was always just like a holding date, but that would have been a great window. And then you get into the new year, and the studio looks at every other film they're releasing, and where does everything work in together, and how are they going to release each different film, and they came back and said, we think there's a great window in August, and this is what we want to do, and that's what's happening.
So Friday, the Frozen Ground.
So yeah, the following Friday.
It's just, I really appreciate the fact that you filmed this in Alaska, and that you tried to tell our story, and from everything I'm hearing from Alaskans who have seen it, I have yet to, is that you, in your film debut, did this amazing thing, and I think you have so much to be proud of.
Oh well, thank you. It's been an incredible journey. It started with when you start talking to real people about events like this, and they're serious events, and I knew from the very beginning I didn't want to make something that was commercializing or glorifying these horrific events, and I also knew, and then I'd come to up to Alaska a couple of times, and each time, everybody you meet knows someone or is connected in some way to someone who was connected to the case, or knew the Hansons, or went to school with the kids, or was an officer, or found a body, or amazing. And I knew right away then it was like, this film can only be made in Alaska. There's no way I'll make it anywhere else.
Well, we're at the bottom of the hour already. Scott Walker, director, writer of The Frozen Ground, which is coming out this Friday. Thank you so much for coming on with us.
Thank you for your time. It's been wonderful.
All
Enjoy
right.
the film.
I certainly will. Thanks so much. This is Shannyn Moore. You too. This is Shannyn Moore, The Shannyn Moore Show. You're listening to us here at KOAN. We'll be right back.